Board level compliance is often discussed as a framework problem, but in daily reality, it falls on ownership problem and later becomes an evidence problem in 2026. Boards are under pressure to demonstrate not just we have policies, but we own the risk as well. How decisions are made and what proof exists when auditors, regulators, or incidents test the story. Today's episode directly gets into the uncomfortable gaps. Compliance without risk ownership becomes a theater, and the theater collapses the moment evidence is requested. Or when digital transformation, AI adoption, vendors, and people drive workloads accelerating faster than governance. Our guest, Shailu Bharadwaj, board advisor, director ESG, and corporate governance specialist with 20 years of experience spanning across strategy, HR, leadership, financial acumen, and digital transformation, brings boardroom lens that connects governance intent to operational proof. Let's welcome Shalu to our podcast and dive into the topic. Good evening, ma'am. Welcome to our podcast.
Yeah, hi. Good evening, Mr. Prem Kumar. I'm honored and really I impart my thanks to you to invite me to this podcast on a very short notice. But then it's close to the heart that we are speaking together publicly. And I think you've already given a short profile of mine, which is being detailed over the screen. So we can, speak about the topics that you are bringing to the people those who are interested to attend this and those
Yeah.
who are actually attending.
Thank you for that, madam. We'll dive into the topic and we will start looking at the questions that we wanted to have your inputs on. Now, when boards say we are compliant, what exactly should they mean in outcomes, not documents?
Yeah, very rightly pointed out. Boards often say, when they say, we are compliant, the phrase go far beyond, having just policies or binders of policies or checklists or documents, right? Basically, the true compliance is in terms of outcomes and outcomes which has been traceable and measurable. So it exactly means the when I say true compliance is about outcomes, the lived reality of how the organization operates in a real world. So that actually defines its practice and where it means, we are not just compliant in policy and existence, but actually in practice.
Said, madam, because we don't want to look at documents going forward, is what we see. And with that, we want to see the outcomes coming in every activities that we are taking care. Now, what are three outcomes a board should demand that prove compliance is real?
Yeah, not just three, there would be, a list of outcomes, which would actually mean in practice when the outcome, the compliances and the outcomes the board should mean by what we are, the way we are complying. So in reality, when an organization operates under stress, the first measurable outcome is in practice or in actuality or in reality, how much there is risk reduction or they have mitigated on the risk part. You know, the the organization has an actual exposure towards legal, financial, reputational, and operational risks that we have often, I think, everybody is witnessing these days. Now, these risks are they actually minimized, which is the first outcome? Have they measured it, or it's just existing in the policy or a framework that they've documented? So, what I would say the key distinction between a documents or having a compliance is, if you have policy and documents in existence, then that is the evidence of existence. The board see that there is a framework policy in which has been implemented. That's a evidence of existence that we have controls in place. But yeah, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Sorry. So where I was, the key distinction between the having documents or compliance in place is that if the evidence of impact is there. The outcome is an evidence of impact. What impact exactly the organization has put into its stakeholders, employees, and being operationalized in practice. So the key distinction is whether evidence is in what do you call intent, or the evidence is having an impact. So this is the key distinction between outcome and having a compliance as a documentation policy. That's it. There's three. I would say the factors is one outcome is risk mitigation and reality. If they could measure it, and they could see that the boards could see that it's not just documented. The second is ethical conduct, which is embedded in the culture, like the employees, the leaders, they are consistently acting in line of regulations and the laws, and in a responsible behavior in an ethical way. And so where what we see is that even if nobody is watching us, the employees and leaders are acting consistently within the act of regulations and the laws in place. This is what ethical or ethical conduct, what I mean to say here is. The third outcome is stakeholder trust, the stakeholder confidence in the organization and their practices. Now, what I mean here is investors, regulators, and communities, they can see evidence of responsible behavior. The compliance is visible in outcomes like safe products, transparency in reporting systems, or fair treatment. Right? This is the third outcome, which is seen, which is visible. The fourth is the resilience under pressure. The organization, when tested, like let's say the audit crisis is there, investigations are there. The organization can demonstrate, it should be demonstrated that controls work in practice and not just on the documents. This is that is what we call it, the organization resilience under stress. This should be witnessed as an outcome. Now there is continuous improvement, like what I would say is compliance isn't static. The boards should mean that systems are, adaptive, they're learning, progressive, and evolving with new regulations and risks. That is a continuous improvement. Right? This is
Thank you for
the
that. Thank you for
sorry.
that, Matt. So,
Yeah.
what is the key difference between control existence and control effectiveness at the board level? You can give some light around it, madam.
Yeah, surely. See, it's actually a distinction between a form and a function, right? When
Okay.
control existence means, as what I just mentioned here, you have a policy, risk control, framework. Every control is documented and present, so it is existing in your system. It's documented. You have a policy, you have a framework, you have controls. Proof is that you have the policy and the frameworks in existence. They exist. That is the proof. So it is the control existence with proof. So generally, the leaders or whomsoever is managing these controls and functions, they actually say that we have policy and frameworks in existence. We have it in place. Now the limitation is existence is only an intent, as I said earlier. It doesn't prove or guarantee the risk appetite and the tolerance where it is defined. It's not respected. So what I mean to say, control effectiveness comes into the form when it is basically it is functioning. Your control is functioning. It is measurable. It's not just existing in the form of a policy. You can trace it, you can mitigate it, you can measure it in the form of the control is working with regular audits. Repeatability, I would say there are three factors: repeatability and consistent audits, and monitoring, effective monitoring systems of all your controls which are existing. Are they working in practice? Is there any ownership to it? Is there any accountability to practice it regularly? There are quarterly audits which are monitored. Monitoring systems are in place. When they are monitored, that means they are function. It's not just a form, they're functioning in practice. So this is control effectiveness. You have it in place, but it is effective once it is monitored and measured.
Are saying is we need to anchor the board in such a way that the board language is made clear to them. Risk appetite is made clear to them. Accountability, measurable proof is given, and repeatability, push beyond policy signed into decisions and evidence into monitoring is what we are saying. Compliance
Yeah,
isn't a claim is what we are saying. It's an outcome of you can which you can defend, because
yeah,
outcomes also say these are the pointers that we can look at and this is where we stand, right? This is not
yeah.
claim per se. Now, coming to that point, why does compliance fail without clear ownership? Because that's the point that we want to drive here, even if the controls exist.
Yes, I think it's a very critical point. And controls without clear risk ownership, they are just shallow. They are hollow in place, right? Now, how it works, why compliance collapses in the absence of ownership? If nobody is accountable, there's no ownership, the failures would definitely happen. Who owns that failure, right? Who owns that failure? If nobody owns the failure, there's no accountability. They would become exceptions and then they are stopped, right? They're not followed up. So what I would say is why compliance fails without risk ownership. I would indicate a couple of points here. One is a risk appetite misalignment. Right? Risk appetite is basically a term where board define your risk tolerance levels or limits. Right? What is your risk tolerance level? Like there is a zero tolerance for any data breaches. Right? Zero tolerance. Now there is a minimum tolerance, adaptable or acceptable tolerance for, let's say, any policy deviation. So this is a risk appetite, and the levels are defined by the board. Now, if there is any misalignment between the risk appetite, how it goes, controls may exist, but without accountable owners, there is no one that ensures that they operate within the board's defined risk appetite or tolerance. What is the result then? Now, risk often drift outside the tolerance limit of the level which has been defined by the board. And the board has no measurable proof of alignment of this risk appetite because they're falling apart. Right? This is one thing. So there's a risk appetite misalignment that board has defined, and the in the absence of ownership, you do not have proof, and it is not measurable. It's falling. It drifts outside that, outside the tolerance limit. The second factor which comes in here is accountability gap. If no one is explicitly responsible or accountable, failures are treated as systemic rather than personal. Please, this point is very important. No ownership, nobody is responsible. What do they see or foresee it? The failures are treated as systemic problems, errors, when they are not. Your system is in place, but without any ownership, and without any responsibility, the failures are treated as systemic, often in the organization, rather than personal. Now, result is issues are turned or buried, they're turned off, and corrective action stall and accountability evaporates. So, this happens without ownership, even if the control exists, how it fails. Then controls without stewardship, of course, existence is not equal to effectiveness. You have something which is existing, but it's not effective, it's not functioning. There's no monitoring, there's no ownership to its, no accountability, ownership of the accountability of that particular control. Right? The controls need active monitoring, testing, and escalation. Now, active monitoring, testing, and escalation often requires a true ownership to that particular control. Who is actually owning it? So, in the absence of this ownership, without ownership, controls degrade over time and they become just a paper or a document work. Right? The result is that repeatability is lost and controls may work once but not consistently over the years. Right? In the absence of ownership. Now there is no measurable proof. What I said earlier, ownership is what drives reporting, metrics, and assurance. Anybody who's accountable would definitely report that. They will have metrics in place. They will have assurance, independent assurance. So ownership is what drives reporting, metrics, and assurance. Now, without it, boards receive documents but not outcomes. Right? They receive the documents. What is the result then? Directors cannot see evidence that compliance is real. Only that policies exist. That happens without the ownership, why compliance fails. So I would say there are a few questions here, boardroom and on boardroom language failing, I would say. A risk appetite, you can put a question. Who owns ensuring this risk stays within tolerance? Risk appetite. The accountability, Who is personally answerable if this control fails? This is the accountability. The- in terms of measuring the proof or evidence, the question could be what evidence shows the control is working in practice. This is the measurable proof. Now, repeatability is how often, how do we know this outcome will be consistently or quarterly measured, repeatedly. So this is what is repeatability. These questions I think the board should ponder or ask the management when the compliance fails without ownership. This is next.
So, what these pointers are very valid pointers when we go into board and see where are the controls happening and how are the
Yeah,
controls measured. Now, where
yeah.
does the ownership usually blur? Business, IT security, legal, HR, vendors, and why?
Sorry, come again.
Now, where does this ownership naturally blur? Whether it is
Uh-huh.
business, IT, security, legal, HR, vendors, and why? Where does this fail?
Yeah, see, ownership often blurs at the seams between different verticals, different functions, especially where risk cut across silos. Let us say, I'll give you an example. For example, there are business units in place. Right? The business units assume IT and network security people as compliance people. Generally, right? This is what is the assumption. But they actually generate the operational risks like this. Secondly, IT, what IT does, I tell you, IT simply focuses on the system uptime, right? And not regulatory exposure. And they assume that the exposure belongs to the legal teams, right? The compliance and regulatory, it belongs to legal. This is what the IT assumes. Now the security comes to the security. It manages technical controls. That's it, because the controls, technical security is in their domain, but often lacks authority over business processes. Right. This is one. Now, the next function is legal, which is a very important and quite a very significant function in the organization. Legal is only busy in drafting policies, right? And they doesn't operationalize them. They assume HR or any regulatory function or business enforces it. This is the legal assumption, the legal function. Now, the HR owns conduct and culture. They are happy with that, owning conduct of the people like a mother of the organization and culture of. But they defer it to the legal department when it comes to regulatory matters or any compliance behaviors. Similarly, you go to vendor and third parties, the critical risks are outsourced in the organization these days. But accountability often, which is very unclear between the contract managers and the compliance which is existing in the organization. So it actually, why it matters, ambiguity creates gaps and gaps create exceptions and exceptions become normalized. Something which is normalized, it replaces the real accountability. This is how it blurs between the functions. The one function expects the other to actually, taking care of the crucial part, which is actually not happening. It blurs at the intersection.
What we are saying is it is not one person's responsibility. It becomes multi people responsibility when it comes to control, because that ambiguity that we see between teams from the IT and the security teams, and this has been a challenge for a very long time on the security side, because IT feels security should be part of security feels IT should be part of security. So that game has always been there where we see, but actually, if you really look at the controls or effectiveness, is the whole organization's responsibility. The security team provides the controls for us to follow, but it gets the gaps of not getting the buy-in at most of the times is what I understand. Now, ambiguity creates that gaps, and gaps create expectations. Expectations become normal, and board fixes ambiguity through explicit ownership and escalation paths. So that's the way that we look at the whole picture. Now, if you own it, no one, if everyone owns it, and no one is the owner, that's what we are talking about in our podcast today,
Yes, yes. This
right?
usually happens when the ownership is not there. There's nobody who's owning that risk and control in practice. It is blurred. The accountability is blurred. Everybody is assuming the other function to actually
Is
take
the
care of
owner
it,
of it.
and
Yeah.
it's not happening.
What does evidence mean in the board governance and why do teams struggle to produce it?
Sorry, come again.
What does evidence mean to the board
Hmm.
governance and why do teams struggle to produce that?
Oh, very important question. This is a great question. The evidence in the board governance terms, I would explain it as a measurable proof, right? The board governance language says that you have to have a measurable proof, something you can measure it. The proof or evidence which is existing in the organization is measurable, traceable, repeatable, and could be, it should be quantitative. It could be measured in some terms. Now, that compliance and risk controls, they are delivering outcomes in practice and they are aligned with the risk appetite, the tolerance limit which has been defined by the board. This is what the evidence actually means in terms of governance language. Right? Evidence is equal to outcomes which are measurable and it should be aligned with the risk appetite. This is what it is. And I would say there is a RACI model. I think I would like to mention out here. The board they actually want a very lean model, which is a RACI model. Repeatability, or responsible behavior. One is the R stands for responsibility, the responsible, the executive or the function who's directly managing the risk, the responsible person. Then let's say CIO, Chief Information Officer, responsible for cyber threats or cyber security. Very clear. Similarly, CHRO, Chief Human Resource Officer, is chiefly responsible for the conduct in the organization. It's very simple. This is the board want to look at the responsibility who's owning that. So accountability comes in a single named leader. I would say a leader, usually he could be a business unit leader or a head or a owner, business owner, who answers to the board, let's say if any controls fails, right? Any responsibility is not happening or accountability doesn't happen. So if it fails, there is a leader which we say is accountable to the board to explain it, why it happened. The consultative consultation, wow, the third domain that comes in when board expects anybody who is consulted in the organization, like the legal department, the compliance department, the risk functions, who advise the board and interpret that also. Then the fourth factor or the fourth word, which is RACI, is informed. Who is informed? The board committees and the regulators and the board committees who receive measurable proof of outcomes is they are actually they want every information or every control or evidence which is happening. It should be as an outcome. It should be reported to them. So this is the RACI model which board expects in any organization as a lean model. Right? So this is what is their expectation in terms of governance. But I don't know whether it is happening into a couple of organizations or not. This is up to them. But this is the model which is being defined.
Got it, madam.
Yeah.
What are the top five evidence artifacts board should
No,
see?
sorry, I have not answered your why the team struggle to,
Yeah,
the
okay.
teams struggle to produce evidence. See, the teams are usually in the organization, teams are usually busy in the existence, the policy, the preparing the documentation, preparing very good slides, right? The reports. They're only busy with the, what do you call, a draft report with evidence, right? These show intent. What I say, evidence of intent. The teams are busy in that, not impact. Now, what is the result? Boards receive binders of policies or the drafted report by the teams, but not exactly the measurable outcomes. Now, there is a blurred ownership, which I've already defined you. Blurred ownership, where the one function assumes the other to be accountable for a particular control or risk. So it happens. The result is that evidence is fragmented and inconsistent or absent in this, where it is blurred. Now, there is a lack of measurable metrics. Let's say the controls are described qualitatively in the report, and that we have a policy which is existing, and not not quantitatively, which is measured in terms of some metrics that is not defined by the teams generally, or they do not even detail it. So let's say, for an example, I would say controls are described qualitatively in a para. They don't say, it doesn't say that the regulatory violations are happening or reduced by 40%, right? If there is a metric that says that regulatory violations or breaches are reduced or mitigated by 40% or 30% or 50%, that's a metrics that is not defined by the team. They actually struggle to produce it qualitative drafted report, not quantitative. And as I mentioned earlier, there is normalization of exceptions. Ambiguity create gaps, and gaps create exceptions. And when it normalizes, so the result is that teams stop escalating the failures. Team stop escalating the failures. It stops. So evidence of breakdowns never reaches the board. Actually,
Okay.
this is what has happened.
I got it. So it is more pointers that they have defined, and we are not able to come into the picture where we can produce such kind of an evidence, which is 40%, 30%. That evidence we are not able to match, is what we are saying. And also, people struggle more on the documentation, looking right to the show to the board, is what also we are trying to understand. What are the top five evidence artifacts board should see regularly? Because boards nowadays look at evidences very closely, because the fines are becoming very prominent and all those things. Now, they should not look at annually, is what we are saying. What is the five evidence artifacts the board should see regularly, is what we are trying to find out.
Yeah, this is a great question. Boards should actually demand consistent, time-stamped, traceable, measurable, role-owned, right, evidences, and they don't look for any annual surprises in terms of any at the end moment reports. Right? They demand actually consistent, traceable, time-bound, time-stamped, in fact, and role-owned evidence. Now, the five artifacts, the board should see regularly is one is a dashboard. That's a risk appetite dashboard. The board, as I mentioned earlier, they define a risk appetite and the tolerance level in an organization for every risk and controls in practice. Now, evidence that exposures are within board approved tolerances or they are time stamped metrics, or showing breaches, near misses, and the corrective actions they are in place. This is a risk appetite dashboard which should explain all these things. Right? The time stamped metrics, the breaches are shown there, and what they have missed, it should be shown. Corrective actions should be mentioned in the dashboard. This is one thing. Now, there are control effectiveness reports. As I said, evidence in existence and effectiveness. Effectiveness, as I said, when it is in practice. Regular, consistent quarterly audits or ongoing testing, traceable logs, I would say. Traceable logs are often, I don't know whether they are being reported in some terms, showing controls worked under stress or failed with escalation. That should be mentioned. Anything which has failed with escalation or not escalated should be mentioned. So this is the control effectiveness report they should produce. This is the second artifact that the board should look into. The third is that incident and exception logs. There's a transparent report of compliance failures, escalations, and resolutions. And it shows whether exceptions are rare or becoming normalized. These are incident and exception logs. They should actually, the board should look into or have an oversight on this. Now there is accountability chains which would actually reflect evidence of who owned what, who owned each risk, clear accountability of each risk defined. So there is an accountability chains that could be defined. The board would like to look into that. What actions were taken and when they were taken. Now there is a role-owned documentation, and that should prove the accountability in practice. There has to be a role-owned documentation that should board look into this artifact. Then there is an independent assurance snapshot. Independent assurance means you have a quarterly internal audit or a regulator feedback from an external facilitator. Right? And external validation is actually the evidence which is credible and repeatable. It's not just the inside reporting happening in an organization, but an independent authority or external validation is required. A board should look into this artifact as well. Hello.
Yeah, yeah, I am that one. So
Yeah.
how do we look at or how do we stop evidences becoming the last minute audit scramble? Because most of the times we are not ready and we get the reports at the last which are not verified. So how do you take this point up?
Yeah. Evidence should be captured in the operations. They should be what I would say. The evidence capture is operationalized in workflows in practice.
Mm.
The organization should define a workflow system and where these should be operationalized. All the evidences which are captured. Now, the embed evidence and processes could be the automated logs, right? The dashboards and control testing into daily workflows. And then probably the example could be incident management system producing all the logs, right? It's an that generates the automated logs and the what do you call the role owned capture. Role owned capture is like each accountable owner must produce an evidence as part of their routine daily and not at the end time of when the audit is happening or as an audit afterthought. They should actually include as a routine practice anybody who's accountable for any evidence who's capturing it. Now, the consistency and repeatability, as I mentioned earlier, if any control practice or evidence which is captured should be generated continuously and consistently. Now, let's say if any the person who is owning a risk and capturing an evidence is bringing into a routine activity and not actually depending on the audit afterthought or end moment of when audit is happening, is basically what you call we can avoid this last minute audit scramble or things like that. Including it into continuous workflows, operationalized systems is the best way to capture an evidence into routine. And then it comes to consistency and repeatability. You are looking into the controls or evidence. Uh, the organization should not stop quarterly and then you've forgotten. It should be repeatable. If you're not repeating it quarterly or consistently, of course you lose it, and the end time audit sampling or end time audit functioning is not the actual aim which any organization, any function should go ahead with. This actually, it shatters everything. There has to be quarterly review reports by the which should be presented as a annual scrum note.
I think what you are saying is evidence equals consistency, traceability, time stamped, role owned. What you said in the earlier thing, operationalized evidence, because it should go through the workflows, not just having spreadsheets, right? So that's what we
Yes,
said, and
yes,
while we also say controls don't protect you, evidences does, because when you have an evidence saying that the control is effective, that's where you say this is an implemented control and this is a measurable control, right? So that's the point that we want to give it back to what we are saying when we talk about scrambled thing. We don't want to have last minute reports, is what we are saying. And what should auditors look for versus boards think matters? Where is the mismatch?
this is a classic tension point, between how the auditors look for control, existence, and the documentation, while boards actually care about risk appetite that define accountability, ownership, and outcomes. So I'll just carry out a few indicators here. What auditors actually look for is a control existence, a documented report. The control is existing. There is a documented policy or procedure or system in place. Right? Now, the compliance is having and standards in place. We are, CISA, CISO, everything is being followed, and controls having the compliances with actually, followed with the standards. They are in place, and they should actually look into does the organization meet regulatory and accounting requirements often. Now, evidence of testing. They are the controls which are tested and then documented. Tested and then documented. Even if only if you're doing it once a year, it doesn't matter. But if you've tested something, documented, evidence of testing. So that an auditor looks for. The process adherence, of course, organization is following its stated processes or not. The auditors look into that. Now, audit trail is, of course, can the auditor trace actions back? Can the auditors trace all the actions back to a documented report, or or any logs sort of thing? And so it actually, when the board comes into practice, or when the board comes versus auditor, what they look for. The boards actually, what they think is, as I told you, there's a risk appetite alignment. Whether the risk appetite tolerance, the risk is not drifting away from that. It's falling within that, where it is defined. They have defined a tolerance limit and it should fall within the tolerance levels. This is the risk appetite alignment with risks are demonstrable and aligned with the tolerance levels, approved by the board. Next, they look for accountability. Who is accountable? Who owns each risk? What is the ownership? And what happens when the control fails? Even if the ownership is there, who's accountable? And if it fails, what happens? It should be reported. The boards look for a measurable proof. What matrices you have in place, the assurance, I would say, that outcomes are consistent, traceable, and measurable. You have a matrix every quarter, and it's not just happening at the audit time, it's happening consistently and regularly and repeatedly. That's a repeatability and with a measurable proof, I would say. The next is the stakeholder confidence. The boards look for the investors, the stakeholders, the community, and the customer. Are they in faith? Is everything is in transparency? There is transparent reporting which is happening to our stakeholders. They look for the proof that compliance builds trust with our stakeholders. That's what board actually look for. Stakeholders, investors, often they're the very key people to any organizations. This is how the mismatch is. The auditors, they look for the form. The controls exist. Documents are in order, and boards actually look into the function. Controls deliver outcomes. Risks are within the appetite. These are the two functions defining their how do they actually see the controls and risks. The result is board often get binders of audit evidence, but little assurance as an independent assurance or a third, the external validation that compliance is really in place. This is the mismatch.
Pointers now. What board packs create false confidence? Good slides, weak proof.
Sorry, come again.
Which board packs create false confidence? Good slides or weak proof?
Okay. Board packs that create false confidence. Of course, see, I tell you, the boards often receive polished decks that look convincing, but lack of measurable proof is there, as I said. The common example are heat maps, right? Heat maps and traffic lights. I tell you, in audit reports, generally they use the traffic lights, red, green, yellow, blue, purple in the slides, right? Now, red, amber, green slides suggest control status, but rarely show the test results or traceability. Yeah. It's the status has been uploaded and been reflected in the report. The false confidence is green is based on self-reporting and not an evidence. This is the false confidence. Now, the policy and framework summaries, how it happens, slides listing policies, codes of conduct or frameworks. The false confidence comes into the form where existence is there, but it's actually not equal to effectiveness. Right? Now, what I mean to say, there's no proof of outcomes which is being detailed in your policy or the framework summaries that been present in the report. Next is that training confirmation. You would often see the slides in the report would be defining how many people are trained, percentage, total number of people trained completion rates, I would say. High percentages of staff trained, but false confidence is the attendance is there, but are you able to bring in the behavioral change? So the behavioral change of those, you are mentioning an attendance of the staff, but have you measured it? There is no link to the reduced incidents to it. You understand? The training of the staff is being reflected, but not a behavioral change is measured.
Got it, madam. So the reports are obviously effectiveness is not coming up, is what we are saying when we look at these reports.
Yeah, that brings a false confidence that everything is in place, status is there, as they use heat maps, lights, training staff. They've trained that much of people on this particular controls or risk, everything. They just the reports goes as a status, existence, not as a how it is affected,
Okay.
not in a measurable or traceable terms. That is where the false confidence is created for the existence.
Got it. So, what do auditors ignore be- because it's not testable, even if it sounds impressive?
Uh, I would also highlight one point here that there, sometimes the organization in reports highlights the success stories, right? They write
Hmm.
the narrative stories, but the false confidence comes into the place that it can't replace the measurable and repeatable outcomes, I mean, or evidence. Now, what auditors ignores because it is not testable is I said that the point number one is culture at the top tone. The culture is not measurable. The auditors generally ignore where it is hard to test. Auditors, stick to documents. They are least bothered about behavioral concerns or culture in the company. The employee who's managing your risk, his behavioral change, that's he's bringing the evidence capture, everything into routine practice. They're accountable, everything. They're not testing the behavioral change. That is the culture. Okay. So they stick to documents and not behaviors of themselves. Risk appetite alignment often overlooked or ignored by the auditors. Auditors check compliance with rules, but not whether risks are falling within the board tolerances, within the tolerances which has been defined. Risk appetite alignment is not there. Stakeholder trust and reputation, they are not bothered much about it. They are bothered about the audit trails, the documented report, what they presented to the board. They're ignoring the reputation, the stakeholder trust or investors trust, which is not quantifiable actually in audit terms, I would say. Then exception normalization, as I say, the assumptions become gaps, exceptions, and then the exceptions become the normalizations. So they ignore these exceptions. The exception normalization, generally auditors make a note of exceptions but don't test whether they have become a routine or why it is happening, why has it been normalized. So it's a routine activity, something is normalizing and you're not testing it. They generally ignore that, any exception. The rest comes the remediation closure quality is weak or poor. I would say auditors confirm issues are closed, but they are not actually, pondering on the quality of the remediable action which they've taken. But they don't test if the issues are fixed. If they're fixes, whether it is the fixes are happening for a long term or for a short term. So that we say is this remediation closure quality is very important. It's generally ignored by the auditors.
What we are saying is it move from the narrative to the testability piece, right? Sampling is
Yeah.
what we should look at,
Yes.
traceability, exception
Yes.
handling, and remediation to closure. Not to say that it is fixed, but it is closed and it is not going to affect the system again, is one pointer that you want to look at. And
Right.
audits fail at the last mile where proof disappears, is what we are saying in as many sense that we're talking about. How do ESG and cybersecurity compliance intersect at the board level, and where do the boards get it wrong?
ESG and cybersecurity intersect at the board level. Huh?
Right. Yeah.
It's a very sharp question, right? ESG and cybersecurity, they are often treated as separate domains altogether. One is dealing with digital, and the other is with total sustainability. ESG is dealing with the sustainability, and of course, cyber dealing with the digital practices. Now, but where they intersect in an organization is where they are strategic, right? They're both of them are strategic function, even being the fact that they are two separate functions. Now, where they intersect is there is strategic function and not just technical. And I would say in terms of ESG and uh, cybersecurity, the first factor is stakeholder trust, where they intersect. Right, ESG sustainability is often measured in terms of your stakeholder trust. I would say ESG emphasizes transparency, ethical conduct, and responsible stewardship. Cybersecurity underpins that trust by protecting your data, privacy, and digital assets. The intersection point here is a breach undermines ESG credibility. Data privacy is actually now a core ESG mandate, I would say. It's a metric. Now, the risk appetite alignment, where the intersect is risk appetite alignment, a tolerance limit defined. ESG sets expectations for sustainability and resilience in the organization. Cybersecurity defines tolerance for digital risk. Right? This is very clear. And the intersection is the boards must ensure that the cyber risks they are managed within ESG commitments like protecting customer data, digital logs, supply chain, data reports, and integrity. So they are protecting the customer data and supply chain data. So that's an intersection point over here. Next comes in terms of accountability and governance. ESG frameworks they demand clear accountability for environmental, social, and governance structures outcomes. I would say. Cybersecurity requires explicit ownership of digital risks. Now, the intersection is both fail without role-owned accountability. Right? Accountability and governance without any ownership, without any role defined, any role owned, it fails. So, and often escalation points if it's not defined. So, this is the intersection. If both fails without a role which is not owned, a role owned accountability, and escalation points. This is the intersection point with risk appetite alignment. Next is the evidence and assurance. So, ESG reporting requires measurable proof in terms of carbon footprints, diversity metrics, and ethical sourcing. Cybersecurity requires testable evidence, incident logs, for example, penetration testing, and remediation closure, I would say. So intersection is boards must demand consistent, traceable, time-bound, time-stamped, and role-owned evidence across both the domains, ESG and digital. This is the intersection. In terms of evidence and evidence capture and assurance. These are the intersecting points.
Thank you for that, madam. And with that, I would like to come to a pointer where we say frame ESG as a governance maturity, consistent oversight, stakeholder trust, resilience, tie cybersecurity, and credible pillar of ESG narrative. So that's the pointer that we can look at when we talk about ESG and cybersecurity
Very,
intersection.
very, very important point. Yeah,
Now,
because
ESG credibility collapses the moment the trust fails. That's what you
huh,
said, right?
the cyber security is they're safeguarding the privacy of all the data which they are maintaining. So
Okay.
this is where ESG, this is basically an ingredient of ESG metrics,
And
cybersecurity.
with that, we are on top of the hour. I would like to summarize some of the pointers that we have taken part of the discussion, what we had so far over the last board level compliance fails first in the ownership, then in the evidence is what we said. And if proof is hard to produce, the control is not operational. So I think one way or the other, where we are saying what is not in a position to be measured cannot be put as an evidence, right? So that is what we are saying. It is a performative activity, but not having a proof. ESG and cyber and AI governance converge into one board mandate: trust plus definitability is what we are saying. And incentivize shape behavior is determines whether compliance survives daily operations. That's what we want
Right,
to look at. And with this, I think we are on top of the hour, madam. You also have to look at continuous monitoring, which is not tied to the annual pointers where we used to be doing checklists or following up, because
absolutely,
this
absolutely,
moves
right,
every day today with the AI advent, where you see threats evolving, frameworks evolving, even the standards getting updated. So it is a daily task that we should look at monitoring,
right,
because checklists are gone is what we
right.
want to say. Any final pointers? to the audience you want to do before we close the podcast, man?
Final point is, I would say, I think all the questions which you have given me as a list of where the compliance fails, what is the evidence, what matters with traceability and measurable outcomes. They're all important questions, very important pointers in an organization. And what I would say, the governance failure, it happens when you have a compliance and everything in place, but you don't have a ownership. You don't have a measurable, what do you call, proof of that. You don't have a matrix. You have a matrix, but it's not happening consistently. You have everything in place. Even you have a metrics, measurable, traceable logs and system, workflows and systems. You have workflows. You have not operationalized it. You are not embedding that into the routine workflow so that it could be captured. You have not defined the ownership consistently, clear ownership or accountability. You have not, if the organization is not even looking into the culture of the company, the behavior, the leaders and the employees, how they should act. Let's say, for an example, you have a whistleblower policy or a hotline in place, right? But it's ineffective if the employee doesn't use it, if the employee doesn't trust that, employee doesn't have a trust to use that. So how would that whistleblower hotline or a policy which is existing as a control or a, how you could use it? So I would say unless these things are in practice, and even if you have a metrics in place, evidence capture, everything is in place, but you are not practicing it consistently, and you are not having an external validation also. You don't have a true ownership which is defined for any failure or any accountability. Then things become blurred and things are not, standardized or in a particular form where a board can look into a RACI model, as what I said. So these are the main pointers which we have taken today, and I hope my audience or anybody who's attending our podcast, should actually consider this if they are owning any function or any organization. That's what I want to say for this particular evening.
Thank you for that, madam. With this, we would like to conclude our session. What you would like to suggest as a session? Thank you for bringing out the pointers at a boardroom lens, and that cuts through noise. Compliance is not just one-time project, because it has to be a living governance system powered by ownership and proof, is what we want to say to every listener. Are you compliant is what we want to ask, and who owns the risk, and how can we prove it today is what we want to say with the living pointers there. And with that, we would like to conclude our session, and thank you for joining us, ma'am, today.
Thank you, Mr. Prem Kumar. Thanks a lot.